I'm with Elizabeth Pollman, Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And Elizabeth, we're going to discuss your paper, The Corporate Governance Machine. And I should say, first of all, that this won the Cleary-Gottlieb Law Prize for the best paper in the ECGI Law Series. So many congratulations.
Thank you so much. And to my co-author, Dorothy Lund.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And in that paper, The Corporate Governance Machine, you say that, and I quote, although legal academics have generally focused on corporate law as a key determinant of purpose, our analysis reveals that this element may well be the least important. So that's quite striking. So what is the corporate governance machine, and what elements of it are the most important?
Well, we thought it was important to set out the system that we have. It's from a perspective of U.S. public company governance. And law is certainly important, but it's not the only thing that's important to figuring out questions about purpose.
Yeah.
And we argue that there's three components to the system. There's law, institutions or markets, and culture. And they're all interacting in a way that is orienting the system towards shareholders. And even law itself has, multiple subcomponents. So we discuss corporate law, but also what Congress does, what the SEC does, what the Department of Labor does, because these are all important to issues of corporate governance. And markets and institutions also is composed of a bunch of things. Institutional investors, stock exchanges, proxy advisors, trade associations, and more. And culture, of course, is a harder one to pin down, but we discuss professional education and its role in shaping thinking about the purpose of corporations, both business school and law school education, and also the role of media in shaping that understanding, and also politics.
So when you say kind of law is the least important, it's almost like you're suggesting this is some kind of an interlocking kind of system of dimensions in the machine, and then if you just change one little bit of it over here, you're going to struggle to change the rest of the machine. Is that
thinking about the bigger picture gives you a much more complete sense of what's happening in U.S. public company governance. For example, the corporate law statute has been on the books for a long time in orienting things towards shareholders, but it's been on the books in periods of the 20th century when we had managerialism.
Right.
So what it really takes to understand the bigger picture isn't just looking at the corporate statute, but all of the components. Yeah.
And so one of the things that you say is that this corporate governance machine has tended to co-opt elements of the stakeholderist agenda and orient them towards a sort of shareholder-oriented view. So I'd like to just pick on a couple of examples of that. So one of the ones that you cite is this shift from CSR to ESG. So could you say a little bit on that?
Sure. So CSR, corporate social responsibility, is a concept that's been around, in different forms for a long time, but that term was coined in the 1950s. And when that term was coined, it really was in the context of thinking about corporate power and the role of corporations in society, and it wasn't tied to shareholder value, the use of that term. And over time, things started to shift, and by the 80s, researchers started to look into whether there was a business case for corporate social responsibility. And that really picked up by the early 2000s, around the time when the term ESG was coined.
Right.
And ESG, standing for environmental social governance, that term was used in a way that made the case that there was an alignment between value and values to further long-term value for shareholders through the consideration of these other factors, which is really a different thing than corporate social responsibility. But reframing it in some ways allowed for a bigger tent that could be used by the corporate governance machine that was already oriented towards shareholders and people that believed certain restrictions on fiduciary duties, etc., could buy into this, as well as proponents that wanted something more. So they're really two separate terms, but we can see that corporate social responsibility, while it's been around for a long time, didn't get the kind of mainstreaming in recent decades that ESG did, but that fit better within the existing system that we had in many ways.
That's interesting, and so that's an example of the corporate governance machine deciding that if we put a shareholderist spin on this, we can then kind of run with it and let it grow. But do you think that has actually lessened the extent to which CSR or ESG, whichever you call it, has actually benefited stakeholders beyond shareholders? Has it in some sense sort of blunted the point of CSR?
It's a really hard question, but a good one. of course. So ESG has accomplished a lot, and I think that's worth recognizing, that we're starting to see things in the past even just several years that we hadn't seen for a long time. We've seen, from a U.S. perspective, increases in board diversity. We've seen human capital management attention and disclosures. We've seen a number of other things. So I think there's a lot of things that are happening under this term ESG. At the same time, it is more limited in scope to some extent about pursuing these interests towards long-term value that's still oriented towards shareholders. And so that shapes what we can expect of it. Also, when it's interacting in what we describe as a corporate governance machine, that also informs what you get. There's a potential that the types of things you get are things that can be kind of measured and turned into metrics, and the ESG that you get might be more check the box, one size fits all, etc. So it's a complicated picture.
Yeah, it's a dilemma, isn't it? Because on the one hand, kind of using the machine has meant that we've perhaps made more progress, but perhaps in a narrower range of areas than CSR originally envisaged. Yeah,
it's a complicated picture, but it's one that I think some would see some signs that are positive, and others would be concerned that we haven't achieved as much as maybe some would like to for various stakeholders of the corporation.
Okay. The other example you gave, which I thought was quite interesting, was the one of public benefit corporations, which are required to have a social purpose alongside the benefit of shareholders. And you use that as an example of something that has been sort of distorted by the corporate governance machine. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but say a bit more about that.
Yeah. So in some ways, what you can see is that at the same time as concepts like ESG were coming up and then getting mainstreamed, we also had a pushing out of the traditional, regular, conventional corporate form, the idea of the pursuit of dual purposes, a for-profit firm, but also pursuing social purposes, into an entirely different form of corporation known as the benefit corporation. And in Delaware, it's called a public benefit corporation. And in many ways, that is reflective of the machine in enforcing that, in a sense, or shaping that towards a different corporate form, and also one that's still oriented towards shareholders. Because the benefit corporation or public benefit corporation still has in many ways a structure where the shareholders elect the board of directors. The benefit enforcement proceedings, who has the ability to actually enforce the other kind of social or public benefit purpose, are the shareholders.
It's the shareholders, right. So it only lasts as long as the shareholders themselves want it to last.
So our point is really to describe and analyze the forces that we have of these various players in our system, and what that ends up creating in the world.
And so what do you think the existence of this corporate governance machine means in terms of what we should hope for from corporate governance reforms to promote a more kind of responsible capitalism?
Yeah, well, Dorothy and I, we thought a lot about this, and we think that one implication that might be quite important is that because there are so many institutional players involved and various components that have a reinforcing mechanism orienting towards shareholders, that unless we have some kind of significant paradigm shift in the U.S., which might be something like a really large federal intervention into corporate law and governance or something like that. But absent that happening, we're unlikely to see, we think, really significant changes.
Just because there's too much interlocking stuff that would have to change.
But there is an orientation towards shareholders. So if you're thinking about levers of change, if something can be framed in a way that aligns with the interests of shareholders, that's something that could be kind of engaged and used in the system that we have quite readily. And that's what we see in some sense with ESG, where you get incremental change within the kind of framework that we have.
So some of these ideas actually around promoting shareholder welfare over shareholder value, that's something that you could see getting traction because it's still working through this channel of shareholder primacy in a way.
Potentially so. And that is something that we see discussed in various ways with various terms about what the interests of shareholders really are, and whether that's at the firm level or the portfolio level, et cetera. And so you can see how the conversations that we have exactly evolve in that way.
That's great. Elizabeth, thank you. That was a really insightful, enjoyable conversation.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.